Sometimes the bravest souls are found in the most unexpected places. When everything you've worked for hangs by a thread, it takes just one person willing to risk it all to change your fate. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Clara May Thornton stood on that wooden platform with a noose around her neck. She'd lived 20 years in the mountains, surviving on her own strength and will. Sheriff Dalton wanted her dead because she knew about his crooked dealings. The rope was ready. The crowd watched in silence. Then a poor cowboy with nothing to lose jumped in to save her life. Together, they would have to outrun the sheriff and his men. What secret made Clara May worth killing for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 20 years earlier, Clara May Thornton had arrived in the Montana Territory with little more than a broken heart and a fierce determination to never depend on another soul. The stagecoach had deposited her at the edge of Cedar Ridge on a bitter November morning, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as she shouldered her meager belongings and set. Her sights on the towering peaks beyond the settlement. The mountains called to her with a promise of solitude and self-reliance that her wounded spirit craved. She'd purchased a small plot of land sight unseen, using the last of her savings from her previous life, a life she'd left buried in the dust of Denver, along with dreams that had turned to ash. The deed to 40 acres of rocky terrain and dense pine forest felt like freedom in her calloused hands. Her cabin, built with her own 2 hands and the help of a few sympathetic neighbors, sat nestled in a grove of towering evergreens 3 miles up Copper Creek. The structure was modest but solid, thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. Inside, the furnishings were sparse but functional. A sturdy table she'd crafted from pine planks, a rope bed with a mattress stuffed with pine needles and wild grass, shelves lined with preserving jars and the tools of survival. Clara May had learned to read the mountains like scripture. She could track a wounded elk through snow, identify edible plants by their leaves and roots, and predict weather changes by the way the wind shifted through the pines. Her traplines yielded beaver, mink, and fox pelts that she traded in town for supplies, salt, flour, ammunition, and the occasional luxury of real coffee or sugar. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had initially viewed her with suspicion and curiosity. A woman living alone in the wilderness was an oddity that challenged their understanding of proper society. But Clara May's quiet competence and fierce independence gradually earned their respect. She asked for nothing, caused no trouble, and proved herself capable of surviving harsh winters that claimed weaker souls. Old Doc Henderson, the town's physician and one of the few educated men in Cedar Ridge, had become something of a friend over the years. He appreciated her intelligence and often sought her knowledge of medicinal plants found in the high country. She'd saved more than one life by providing herbs and remedies when his supply of laudanum and quinine ran low. Clara May's got more sense in her little finger than most folks have in their whole head. Doc would tell anyone who questioned her unconventional lifestyle that woman could survive anything these mountains throw at her. Martha Whitmore, who ran the general store with her husband Tom, had grown fond of Clara May's quiet visits to town. She admired the mountain woman's practical dress, sturdy wool skirts, boots built for walking rough terrain, and a hat that actually protected her from sun and weather rather than serving as mere decoration. "She's got more backbone than most of the men in this town," Martha would confide to her lady customers. "Never complains, never makes excuses, just gets on with living." But Clara May's peaceful existence had been increasingly threatened by changes in Cedar Ridge itself. Over the past 5 years, Sheriff Buck Dalton had consolidated power through a combination of intimidation and strategic alliances with less scrupulous elements. What had once been a rough but honest frontier town was becoming something darker. Dalton was a large man with cold gray eyes and a reputation for violence that preceded his arrival in Cedar Ridge. He'd won election as sheriff by promising to bring order to the territory, But his version of order involved lining his own pockets and those of his associates. Small ranchers found their property lines mysteriously shifted. Mining claims were jumped by men who happened to be friends of the sheriff. Business owners who complained about protection fees often found their establishments vandalized or burned. The sheriff's inner circle included his deputy, Snake Morrison, a thin, nervous man with quick hands and quicker temper, and a handful of drifters and gunmen who served as unofficial enforcers. They operated from the sheriff's office during the day and the Lucky Dollar Saloon after dark, holding court like feudal lords dispensing their particular brand of justice. Clara May had witnessed the changes during her monthly trips to town for supplies. Conversations grew quieter when Dalton or his men entered a room. Good people kept their heads down and conducted their business quickly. The laughter and easy camaraderie that had characterized Cedar Ridge was being replaced by fear and suspicion. It was Jake Morrison who had first caught her attention, not because of any romantic inclination, but because he seemed to move through the town like a ghost haunted by his own shadows. He was Snake Morrison's younger brother, but the family resemblance ended at their shared surname. Where Snake was cruel and calculating, Jake appeared burdened by some inner weight that bent his shoulders and clouded his blue eyes. Jake had arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 months ago, following his brother west after years of drifting through cow towns and mining camps. He was a man of average height but solid build, with work-hardened hands and the easy way with horses that marked him as someone who'd spent considerable time in the saddle. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well-maintained. Everything about him suggested a man trying to hold himself together while fighting some internal battle. Unlike his brother, Jake seemed uncomfortable with the fear that Sheriff Dalton's regime had brought to Cedar Ridge. Clara May had observed him during her visits to town, noting how he avoided eye contact with townspeople and seemed to shrink away from conversations about his brother's activities. There was something decent struggling to surface in Jake Morrison, something that his current circumstances were slowly suffocating. Their first real interaction had occurred 3 weeks ago at the general store. Clara May had been selecting supplies when a commotion erupted near the front counter. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who ran a small boarding house, was arguing with Snake Morrison about a debt her deceased husband supposedly owed. "My Henry never borrowed money from nobody," the old woman insisted, her voice shaking with indignation. "He was too proud for such things." Snake's reply was cruel and calculating. "Dead men don't pay debts, Mrs. Patterson, but widows with property can." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Other customers found reasons to examine merchandise elsewhere in the store, unwilling to become involved. But Jake Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with obvious discomfort. "Snake, maybe this ain't the place. Mind your own business, little brother." Snake cut him off with a sneer. "Unless you want to explain to Sheriff Dalton why you're interfering with official business." Clara May had watched the exchange with growing anger. She'd known Henry Patterson, a decent man who'd never cheated anyone in his life. The injustice of the situation stirred something fierce in her chest, something that 20 years of mountain solitude hadn't entirely tamed. "Henry Patterson never owed anybody anything," she said quietly, stepping forward. "And everybody in this town knows it." The store fell completely silent. Snake Morrison turned his cold gaze on Clara May, sizing her up like a predator evaluating potential prey. "Well, if it ain't the Mountain Witch, maybe you should stick to your business up in them hills and leave town matters to folks who understand how things work." Clara May met his stare without flinching. "I understand plenty. I understand the difference between law and lawlessness. Henry Patterson was an honest man, and his widow deserves to be treated with respect." The confrontation might have escalated, but Jake Morrison surprised everyone by stepping between his brother and Clara May. "Come on, Snake. Doc Henderson's waiting for us at the office. Said it was important." Snake looked ready to push the matter, but something in his brother's expression made him reconsider. With a final threatening glance at Mrs. Patterson and Clara May, he stalked out of the store. Jake lingered for a moment, his blue eyes meeting Clara May's with what she could only interpret as gratitude and apology. "Mum," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat before following his brother. Mrs. Patterson had grasped Clara May's hand with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, dear. Thank you for standing up for Henry's memory." That encounter had established an unspoken connection between Clara May and Jake Morrison. During subsequent visits to town, she noticed him watching her with what seemed like curiosity rather than suspicion. He never approached her directly, but she sensed in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to be caught between conscience and circumstance. The tragic irony was that Jake Morrison, the man who would risk everything to save her life, was the brother of the very deputy who helped orchestrate her downfall. But in the complex web of relationships that defined frontier communities, such contradictions were not uncommon. Good and evil often shared the same blood, the same table, the same roof. As Clara May had learned to survive in the mountains by reading subtle signs and trusting her instincts, she'd also learned to recognize the rare souls who retained their humanity despite the harsh realities of frontier life. Jake Morrison was such a soul, and though she couldn't have predicted it at the time, their quiet recognition of each other would prove to be the foundation upon which both their lives would ultimately depend. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a gray shroud when Clara May made the discovery that would change everything. She'd been checking her trap lines along Copper Creek, following the familiar paths that wound through dense stands of pine and aspen. The early October air carried the sharp scent of approaching winter, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that survival depended on preparation. Her practiced eye caught the disturbance before her conscious mind registered what she was seeing. Survey stakes driven into the ground where none had been before. Fresh cut marks on trees that marked new boundary lines. Men had been working here recently, and they hadn't been invited. Clara May knelt beside one of the stakes, running her fingers over the crude lettering carved into the wood. The markings indicated this land now belonged to the Cedar Ridge Land Development Company, an entity she'd never heard of, claiming territory that included not only her own 40 acres, but also the adjoining properties of 3 neighboring families. Her heart began to race as the implications became clear. Someone was stealing land through fraudulent surveys and forged documents. The families who'd worked these plots for years, who'd built their homes and raised their children here, were being robbed by men with official-looking papers and government connections. Moving carefully through the forest, Clara May followed the line of new stakes. The theft was systematic and extensive. The Hendersons' small ranch, where old Pete raised cattle and his wife Sarah tended a vegetable garden that fed half the valley during lean times. The O'Malley homestead, where Irish immigrants had finally found the peace they'd sought in the New World. The Williams place, where a young couple was raising 3 small children in a log cabin they'd built with their own hands, all of it claimed by strangers who'd never set foot on this land until they came to steal. Clara May reached into her saddlebag and withdrew her most prized possession, a small camera. She'd purchased years ago from a traveling photographer who'd needed supplies more than equipment. She taught herself to use it by reading the instruction manual and practicing with landscapes and wildlife. The device had become her way of documenting the changing seasons and preserving memories of her mountain home. Now it would serve a different purpose. She photographed each survey stake, each boundary marker, each fraudulent claim. The camera's mechanical precision captured evidence that could expose this theft if presented to honest authorities. But as she worked, the sound of approaching horses made her freeze behind a large pine tree. Sheriff Dalton's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "Make sure you get every marker placed exactly where the survey shows. We can't have any questions about the boundaries when the territorial office reviews the claims. What about the folks already living here?" The second voice belonged to Snake Morrison. "They ain't gonna just pack up and leave without a fight." Dalton's laugh was cold and calculating. That's why we have legal documents, Snake. These claims were filed properly through proper channels. If the current occupants want to dispute them, they can take it up with the territorial court in Helena. Course, that'll cost them more money than they've got and take longer than they can afford to wait. Clara May pressed herself against the rough bark of the pine, hardly daring to breathe. Through a gap in the branches, she could see the two men directing a survey crew that was methodically documenting the fraudulent claims. The workers moved with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, driving stakes and marking trees with practiced precision. "What about the mountain woman?" Snake asked. "The Clara May's been up here 20 years. She knows every inch of this territory. If anybody's going to cause trouble, it'll be her." Sheriff Dalton dismounted and walked to one of the survey stakes, checking the markings against a folded map he pulled from his coat pocket. Clara May Thornton's got no family, no connections, no political influence. She's a woman living alone in the wilderness. Who's going to believe her word against official government documents? Still, she's got a reputation for being stubborn. Folks in town respect her. "Then maybe it's time Clara May had an accident," Dalton said quietly. "These mountains can be dangerous for someone living alone. Wild animals, rock slides, all sorts of unfortunate incidents." The casual way he discussed her death made Clara May's blood run cold. She'd suspected Sheriff Dalton was corrupt, but the depth of his criminal enterprise was more extensive than she'd imagined. This wasn't just about stealing land. It was about destroying entire communities and eliminating anyone who might interfere with the scheme. She continued photographing, documenting not only the fraudulent markers, but also the faces of the men involved. The camera's lens captured Sheriff Dalton consulting his map, Snake Morrison directing the survey crew, and several other men she recognized as part of Dalton's informal enforcement group. The sound of a breaking branch beneath her foot seemed as loud as gunshot in the quiet forest. Every head turned in her direction, and she realized with sinking heart that her hiding place had been compromised. "Well, well," Sheriff Dalton's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Looks like we have ourselves a visitor." Clara May stepped out from behind the tree, the camera still clutched in her hands. There was no point in pretending she hadn't seen what she'd seen or heard what she'd heard. Her only hope was to project confidence and authority, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Sheriff Dalton," she said evenly. "Interesting to find you so far from town, especially on private property." Dalton's hand moved casually to rest on the grip of his pistol. "Private property? According to these legal documents, this land belongs to the Cedar Ridge Land Development Company. Properly filed, properly surveyed, all above board and legitimate. And I suppose the Henderson Ranch and the O'Malley Homestead just happened to be included in your survey by accident. Mistakes in original land claims happen all the time, Miss Thornton. When the territorial government reviews boundaries, sometimes they find that previous claims were improperly filed or surveyed incorrectly. We're just correcting those mistakes." Clara May raised the camera slightly. "Then you won't mind if I document these corrections for the territorial authorities. I'm sure they'll appreciate having photographic evidence of your thoroughness." The pretense of civility dropped from Dalton's face like a mask falling away. "I'm afraid I can't allow that, Miss Thornton. That camera contains images of sensitive legal proceedings. I'll have to confiscate it as evidence." "Evidence of what crime, Sheriff?" "Trespassing on legally claimed property, interfering with official government business, maybe conspiracy to defraud the Territorial Land Office." Dalton stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Or maybe something worse, depending on how cooperative you're feeling." Clara May backed away slowly, keeping the camera pressed against her chest. "This land has been in these families for years. You can't just steal it with forged papers and expect nobody to notice. I can do whatever the law allows me to do, Miss Thornton. And the law says this land belongs to its rightful owners now." Dalton gestured to his men. "Take the camera. And make sure Miss Thornton understands the importance of keeping quiet about what she's seen here today." But Clara May had not survived 20 years in the mountains by surrendering when faced with threats. As Snake Morrison moved toward her, she turned and ran, with the desperate speed of someone whose life depended on reaching safety. Behind her, she heard Dalton shouting orders to his men. But she had the advantage of knowing every trail, every hiding place, every shortcut through the dense forest. She reached her horse and mounted in one fluid motion, spurring the animal toward the narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains. The camera remained clutched against her chest, its precious evidence intact. But as she rode hard through the forest, dodging low branches and navigating treacherous terrain, Clara May understood that her quiet life of solitude was over. She had become a threat to Sheriff Dalton's criminal enterprise, and men like Dalton did not allow threats to survive. The peaceful existence she'd built in these mountains was about to become a battleground, and she would need every skill she'd learned and every ally she could find to survive what was coming. The camera contained proof of the land theft, but getting that proof to honest authorities would require staying alive long enough to deliver it. And Sheriff Dalton had just made it clear that he had no intention of allowing that to happen. Jake Morrison sat on the weathered porch of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, staring at the tarnished deputy's badge in his palm. The metal was warm from his body heat, worn smooth from years of handling. His father's badge, the only thing of value he'd inherited when tuberculosis claimed the one man he'd ever truly respected. Deputy Marshal Thomas Morrison had been everything Jake aspired to be. Honest, brave, committed to justice even when justice was unpopular or dangerous. He'd worn this badge in Kansas cowtowns, where the law was often the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. He died believing that right and wrong weren't negotiable concepts, that a man's word and his integrity were worth more than gold or land or political connections. You gonna stare at that thing all night? Or are you gonna tell me what's eating at you? Clara May's voice from the shadows of the porch didn't startle him. He'd heard her approach with the quiet step of someone accustomed to moving through dangerous territory undetected. After 3 days of running through the mountains together, dodging Sheriff Dalton's search parties and surviving on whatever food they could find or catch, they developed an awareness of each other that came from shared danger. "Belonged to my father," Jake said, holding up the badge so it caught the moonlight. "Thomas Morrison, Deputy Marshal, shot down in Dodge City by 3 men who didn't want to face a judge for cattle rustling." Clara May settled beside him on the porch steps, close enough that he could smell the pine smoke in her hair from their evening campfire. "How old were you?" 14. Old enough to understand that good men sometimes die for doing what's right, but too young to know what to do with that understanding. They'd taken refuge at an abandoned homestead deep in the mountains, a place Clara May knew from her years of hunting and trapping. The original owners had given up during a particularly harsh winter 5 years ago, leaving behind a sturdy cabin and a few outbuildings that provided shelter while they planned their next move. "Your brother's nothing like your father, is he?" Clara May's question wasn't accusatory, just observant. Jake laughed bitterly. "Snake took after our mother's side of the family. She had a brother who could charm money from a preacher and convince folks that black was white. Snake got that gift for making wrong sound right, except he uses it for darker purposes than Uncle Charlie ever dreamed of. What brought you to Cedar Ridge? You could have stayed anywhere." Jake closed his fingers around the badge, feeling its familiar weight. "Snake wrote me a letter saying he'd found steady work, that there was opportunity in Montana Territory for men willing to work hard. He didn't mention that the work involved terrorizing honest folks and stealing their land." Clara May studied his profile in the moonlight. Despite the rough circumstances of their flight through the mountains, despite the constant danger and uncertainty, she found herself drawn to Jake Morrison's quiet decency. He carried himself like a man burdened by disappointment but not broken by it. "Why don't you leave?" she asked. "You're not bound to your brother's choices." "Been asking myself that same question for months," Jake admitted. "Guess part of me kept hoping I could talk sense into him, maybe help him find a different path. But Snake's chosen his side, and it ain't the side our father would have recognized." The events of the past 3 days had crystallized Jake's understanding of his situation. When Clara May had burst into Cedar Ridge with photographic evidence of Sheriff Dalton's land fraud, she'd forced everyone to choose sides. Most of the townspeople, intimidated by Dalton's power and afraid of retribution, had chosen silence. A few, like Doc Henderson and the Whitmores, had quietly provided assistance. And Jake had made the most important choice of his life when he'd cut Clara May's noose and helped her escape the gallows. "I keep thinking about what my father would say if he could see me now," Jake continued. 28 years old, drifting from town to town, working odd jobs, avoiding responsibility. He always said a man's character is measured by what he does when nobody's watching, when there's no reward for doing right and no punishment for doing wrong. Clara May reached over and gently touched the hand holding the badge. "Seems to me you've been measuring up pretty well these past few days. Could have stayed in town, kept your head down, avoided trouble. Instead, you risked your life for a woman you barely knew. Couldn't stand by and watch them hang you for telling the truth. My father didn't raise me to be that kind of man." "Your father sounds like he was a good man. Best man I ever knew." Jake looked up at the stars scattered across the clear mountain sky. "He used to tell me stories about the early days in Kansas, when he first pinned on a badge. Said the hardest part wasn't facing down gunfighters or tracking outlaws. It was maintaining faith in justice when everyone around you seemed to have given up on it." Clara May understood that burden. Her 20 years in the mountains had been in part an escape from a world where justice seemed negotiable and truth was whatever served the powerful. But her encounter with Sheriff Dalton's criminal enterprise had forced her back into that world, armed with evidence that could make a difference if they could get it to the right people. "What happened to the men who killed your father?" she asked. 2 of them were gunned down by other deputies during the arrest. The third one, man named Garrett Benson, disappeared into Indian territory before he could be brought to trial. Jake's voice hardened. "Never was caught, far as I know. And that's been eating at you all these years." Jake nodded. "My father died believing that justice would be served, that his sacrifice meant something. But sometimes justice needs help, and I wasn't old enough or strong enough to provide it." Clara May was quiet for a long moment, processing not just Jake's words, but the pain behind them. She recognized in him the same wound she carried, the sense that good people suffered while evil prospered. That individual integrity was a luxury that could be fatal in an immoral world. "Maybe this is your chance," she said finally. "What do you mean?" "To finish what your father started. To prove that justice isn't just a pretty word that looks good carved on courthouse walls." Clara May gestured toward the camera bag that contained her photographs. "We have evidence that could bring down Dalton's entire operation, expose the land fraud, return stolen property to its rightful owners. But it's going to take courage to see it through." Jake looked at his father's badge again, remembering the weight of it pinned to Thomas Morrison's chest, remembering the pride in the old man's eyes when he talked about upholding the law. "It's also going to take staying alive long enough to deliver that evidence. Then I guess we'd better start figuring out how to do that." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of horses echoed through the mountain valley. Clara May and Jake both tensed, listening to the rhythm of hooves on rocky ground. Multiple riders moving carefully in the darkness, searching. "Dalton's men," Clara May whispered. Jake stood and offered her his hand. "Time to move again." As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to fade deeper into the mountains, Jake slipped his father's badge into his shirt pocket close to his heart. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of it not as a burden of failure, but as a reminder of the man he could still choose to become. The silver locket had belonged to Clara May's mother, passed down through 3 generations of women who understood that sometimes the most precious things must be hidden to be preserved. As she sat by the small fire in their hidden camp, Clara May turned the delicate piece over in her fingers, feeling the familiar weight of secrets it contained. Jake watched her from across the flames, noting the way her expression softened when she handled the locket. They'd been running for a week now, staying ahead of Dalton's search parties through Clara May's intimate knowledge of the mountain wilderness. But he sensed that the constant flight was wearing on her, not physically. She was tougher than most men he'd known, but emotionally. "Family heirloom?" he asked gently. Clara May nodded, pressing the tiny release that opened the locket's face. Inside, protected by glass, was a small photograph of a young woman with Clara May's determined jaw and intelligent eyes. But it was the second photograph, hidden behind the first, that held the secret she'd carried for 20 years. "My mother, Sarah Elizabeth Thornton," she said, showing him the visible photograph. "She died when I was 16, trying to birth a brother who didn't survive either." Jake studied the image in the firelight. "She looks like you. Same strength in her face. She was stronger than me in ways that mattered. Raised me to be independent, to trust my own judgment, to never let anyone convince me I was worth less than what I knew myself to be." Clara May's thumb traced the edge of the locket. "But she also taught me that some secrets are too dangerous to share, even with people you love." The hidden photograph showed a different woman entirely, elegantly dressed, posed in a Denver photography studio, wearing the elaborate gown and jewelry of high society. But the face was unmistakably Clara May's, 20 years younger and bearing an expression of hope and innocence that the mountain years had weathered away. "That's you," Jake said softly. "That's who I used to be." Clara May Thornton was born the day I walked into these mountains. Before that, I was Clara May Henderson, wife of Marcus Henderson, one of Denver's most prominent businessmen. Jake's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "Henderson. You said the old doc in town was named Henderson. Doc Peter Henderson. Marcus's younger brother." Clara May's voice carried the weight of old pain. "A good man who chose medicine over money, healing over power. He recognized me when I first came to Cedar Ridge, but he's never said a word. Some secrets are family secrets." The story emerged slowly, like water seeping through stone. Marcus Henderson had built a financial empire through railroad investments, mining speculation, and political connections. On the surface, he'd been everything Denver society admired: successful, charming, generous with public donations to worthy causes. "I was 18 when we married," Clara May continued. "Thought I was the luckiest woman in Colorado Territory. Marcus was handsome, wealthy, attentive. He gave me everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful clothes, fine jewelry, a mansion on Capitol Hill with servants and carriages. But the fairy tale had cracked when Clara May began noticing discrepancies in Marcus's business dealings. Money that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Meetings with rough men who didn't fit the profile of legitimate business associates. Conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Marcus explained away the inconsistencies, made me feel foolish for asking questions. But then I started paying closer attention, listening more carefully. Jake tended the fire, giving Clara May time to gather herself for what came next. He sensed they were approaching the heart of whatever had driven her to flee her old life. Marcus was laundering money for a criminal organization that operated throughout the Colorado and Montana territories. Railroad construction funds diverted to private accounts. Mining claims purchased with stolen money. Political bribes disguised as legitimate business transactions. Clara May's voice hardened. And when people asked too many questions or threatened to expose the operation, they had accidents. The locket clicked shut in her hands as she continued. "I documented everything I could find. Account ledgers, correspondence, records of meetings. I was going to take it all to the territorial authorities, expose the entire network. What happened?" Marcus found out. The words came out barely above a whisper. "I'd hidden the evidence in a place I thought was safe, but he had people watching me, people I trusted. The night before I planned to contact the authorities, he confronted me in our parlor." Jake leaned forward, seeing the pain in Clara May's face, even in the flickering firelight. "He didn't lose his temper or threaten me," she continued. "He just calmly explained that I had two choices: forget what I'd discovered and continue being his dutiful wife, or suffer the same accidents that had befallen other inconvenient witnesses. So you ran." I tried to. But Marcus had anticipated that possibility too. He'd already spread word through his network that I was unstable, that I'd been making wild accusations about his business practices. If I'd tried to go to the authorities with my evidence, I would have looked like a hysterical wife trying to destroy her husband's reputation. Clara May opened the locket again, staring at the hidden photograph of her younger self. So I made a different choice. I took what money I could access, destroyed the evidence that would have implicated Marcus, but also endangered other innocent people, and disappeared. You've been hiding here for 20 years. I've been living here for 20 years, Clara May corrected. There's a difference. I built a life in these mountains, found peace and purpose. But I always knew that someday the past might catch up with me. Jake studied her face, understanding now why she'd been so quick to recognize the corruption in Sheriff Dalton's operation. You think there's a connection between Marcus and what's happening in Cedar Ridge? I know there is. Clara May's voice carried grim certainty. The land development company that's stealing claims, it's funded by the same financial network Marcus controlled. The forged documents, the political connections, the systematic intimidation of honest citizens. It's the same pattern, just moved north into new territory. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Your husband is still alive, very much alive, and very much in control of an organization that's grown considerably since I left Denver. Clara May closed the locket and secured it around her neck. The man I married is the one behind everything that's happening here. Sheriff Dalton, the land theft, the threats against innocent families, it all traces back to Marcus Henderson. Jake stared into the fire, processing this revelation. Their fight against Sheriff Dalton's corruption was actually a battle against a much larger, more dangerous enemy. But it also meant that Clara May's evidence could do more than just save a few homesteads. It could bring down an entire criminal empire. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because once you know the truth, there's no going back, Clara May said quietly. Marcus Henderson doesn't forgive or forget. If we move against his operation, we're not just risking our own lives. We're painting targets on the backs of everyone who helps us. Jake reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Then we'd better make sure we don't miss. The locket gleamed against Clara May's throat as she squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his steady presence. The secret she'd carried for 20 years was finally shared, and though the danger had increased exponentially, she no longer felt alone with the burden of truth. The wanted poster fluttered in the autumn wind, nailed to the post office door with the crude efficiency of men who understood the power of public intimidation. Clara May's face stared back from the crude sketch, her features rendered harsh and menacing by an artist more concerned with creating fear than achieving likeness. Wanted for murder and theft, the bold lettering proclaimed. Clara May Thornton, $500 reward for capture dead or alive. Jake studied the poster from the shadow of an abandoned storefront, his jaw clenched with controlled anger. They'd made their way back to the outskirts of Cedar Ridge under cover of darkness, hoping to gauge the town's response to their flight and gather intelligence about Dalton's next moves. The wanted poster answered those questions with brutal clarity. $500, he murmured to Clara May, who crouched beside him behind a pile of discarded lumber. That's more money than most folks in this territory see in 2 years. Clara May's expression remained steady, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes. Being branded a criminal, having her reputation destroyed by lies and fabrications, cut deeper than physical threats. She'd spent 20 years building a life based on honesty and self-reliance. Now Sheriff Dalton had turned her into a pariah with nothing more than ink and paper. Whose murder am I supposed to have committed? She asked quietly. Jake had already read the smaller print beneath the dramatic headline. Says here you killed a survey worker named Billy Crane during a dispute over property boundaries. Claims you stole surveying equipment and government documents before fleeing into the mountains. Billy Crane. Clara May's voice carried a note of recognition. I saw him with Dalton's crew when they were placing those fraudulent boundary markers. Young man, maybe 20 years old, seemed nervous about what they were doing. Probably got cold feet about participating in the land fraud, Jake speculated. Dalton needed a way to eliminate a potential witness and frame you at the same time. The implications were chilling. Not only had Sheriff Dalton murdered an innocent young man, he'd crafted the crime to serve multiple purposes, silencing a potential informant, discrediting Clara May's testimony, and providing legal justification for hunting her down with lethal force. "There's more," Jake said grimly, pointing to a second poster mounted beside the first. This one bore a crude sketch of his own face, along with equally inflammatory accusations. Wanted for conspiracy and murder. Jacob Morrison, $200 reward. Clara May read the charges against Jake with growing anger. According to Sheriff Dalton's version of events, Jake had helped Clara May commit murder, then assisted her escape from lawful custody. He was described as a dangerous criminal who'd betrayed his own brother and turned against legitimate law enforcement. "They're trying to make it impossible for us to find help anywhere in the territory," Clara May observed. "With bounties like that, every drifter and opportunist between here and Helena will be looking for us." Jake nodded toward the main street, where they could see small groups of armed men organizing search parties. Some were obviously Dalton's regular enforcers, but others appeared to be ordinary citizens, motivated by greed rather than genuine belief in their guilt. "Look there," Clara May whispered, pointing toward the Whitmore's general store. Tom Whitmore was speaking quietly with three men Jake didn't recognize, rough-looking characters with the hard eyes and worn weapons of professional bounty hunters. Even from a distance, it was clear they were discussing the wanted posters and the substantial rewards being offered, words already spreading beyond Cedar Ridge, Jake realized. Those men came from somewhere else, probably heard about the bounty through telegraph lines or word of mouth. The situation was deteriorating faster than they'd anticipated. What had started as a local conflict between Clara May and Sheriff Dalton was transforming into a territory-wide manhunt. Marcus Henderson's criminal organization clearly had resources and connections that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. Movement near the church caught their attention. Doc Henderson was walking slowly toward the medical office, his shoulders bent with more than just age. As he passed beneath a streetlight, they could see the exhaustion and worry etched into his familiar features. "He looks like he's aged 10 years in the past week," Clara May murmured. "This is killing him." Jake understood her concern. Doc Henderson was caught in an impossible position, torn between family loyalty to his brother's widow and his duty as a respected member of the community. Supporting Clara May meant risking his practice, his reputation, and potentially his life. But abandoning her meant betraying the principles that had guided his medical career. "We need to get him a message," Clara May said. "Let him know we're all right, that he shouldn't risk himself on our behalf." "Too dangerous," Jake replied. "Dalton's probably watching him, waiting for us to make contact." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A group of 6 riders entered the town from the south, their mounts lathered and their gear suggesting they'd traveled hard and fast. The leader was a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest and the weathered look of someone accustomed to authority. Territorial Marshal, Jake identified, feeling a moment of hope. But their optimism faded as they watched the marshal dismount and walk directly to Sheriff Dalton's office. Through the illuminated window, they could see Dalton greeting the newcomer with the easy familiarity of old associates. Documents were exchanged, hands were shaken, and within minutes it became clear that the territorial marshal was not there to investigate corruption, but to coordinate the manhunt. "The network's bigger than we thought," Clara May said grimly. "Marcus's influence reaches all the way to the territorial government." Jake watched the marshal study copies of the wanted posters, nodding approvingly at their contents. "Or at least deep enough to control the people we'd normally turn to for help." They observed for another hour, documenting the movements of Dalton's men and the growing number of bounty hunters arriving in town. By midnight, Cedar Ridge had transformed from a sleepy frontier settlement into the headquarters of a military-style operation designed to capture or kill them. We can't stay in this area much longer, Jake concluded. Too many searchers, too much money motivating them to be thorough. Clara May agreed, but she was troubled by something else. Look at the families, Jake, the Hendersons, the O'Malleys, the Williams. They're being forced off their land while everyone's distracted by hunting us. She was right. While the town focused on the manhunt and the promise of reward money, Sheriff Dalton's land grab continued unimpeded. Families who'd worked their claims for years were being presented with fraudulent legal documents and given days to vacate property that legally belonged to them. It's brilliant in a sick way, Jake observed. Use us as a distraction while the real crime continues. By the time anyone realizes what happened, the land theft will be complete and irreversible. Clara May's hands clenched into fists as she watched Mrs. O'Malley loading her family's possessions into a wagon by lamplight. The Irish woman's face was streaked with tears as she supervised the loading of everything her family owned, preparing to abandon the home they'd built with their own hands. We have to do something, Clara May said. We can't just run away while innocent people lose everything. Jake understood her feelings, but the tactical situation was becoming impossible. With half the territory looking for us, how can we possibly, by giving them what they think they want? Clara May interrupted, her voice taking on a determined edge that Jake was learning to recognize. By walking straight into the trap they've set for us. Jake stared at her in disbelief. That's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to expose the truth before it's too late to save anyone. Clara May stood, her decision made. Marcus Henderson taught me that sometimes the best defense is an unexpected offense. If we're gonna fight this network, we need to stop running and start attacking. The wanted poster crackled in the wind, Clara May's face grimacing down at them from the crude sketch. But Jake saw determination in the real woman's eyes, the same fierce resolve that had carried her through 20 years of mountain survival. They were outnumbered, outgunned and hunted by every opportunist in the territory. But they had something their enemies didn't expect, the willingness to risk everything for people they barely knew, and the knowledge that some things were worth more than survival. The old telegraph key sat silent in Samuel Hartwell's weathered hands, its brass surface polished smooth by decades of transmitting messages across the vast Montana territory. At 72, Samuel had been operating the remote Copper Falls telegraph station for nearly 30 years, serving as the vital communication link between isolated mountain communities and the outside world. Clara May and Jake had found him that morning, emerging from the pine forest like ghosts materializing from morning mist. The old telegrapher had shown no surprise at their appearance, simply nodding and gesturing them inside his small cabin as if he'd been expecting fugitives to appear at his door. Heard about the bounty? Samuel said without preamble, settling into his chair behind the telegraph equipment. $500 for Clara May Thornton, dead or alive. $200 for Jake Morrison. Seems like a lot of money for a mountain woman and a cowboy. Clara May studied the elderly man's face, trying to gauge whether they'd found an ally or walked into another trap. Samuel Hartwell had the kind of lined, weathered features that came from decades of frontier living. But his eyes remained sharp and alert. We're not the criminals they're making us out to be, Jake said carefully. Didn't figure you were. Samuel's fingers traced the telegraph key's smooth surface. Been working these lines long enough to know when official messages don't match the truth. Sheriff Dalton's been sending a lot of telegrams lately, most of them to places that don't usually conduct business with small frontier towns. Clara May and Jake exchanged glances. Samuel's casual revelation suggested he'd been monitoring communications that might expose the scope of the criminal network they were fighting. What kind of places? Clara May asked. Denver banking houses, territorial land offices in Helena, political offices in Washington. Samuel's voice carried the weight of accumulated knowledge. Lot of coordination happening for what's supposed to be local law enforcement. Jake leaned forward. You've been reading the messages. Part of my job to ensure telegraph communications are transmitted accurately, Samuel replied with a slight smile. Can't do that without understanding what's being sent. The old telegrapher rose and moved to a wooden filing cabinet, withdrawing a folder thick with handwritten transcripts. Been keeping copies of interesting messages for the past 6 months. Habit I developed during the Indian Troubles, when military communications sometimes contained information that civilians needed to know for their own safety. Clara May felt a surge of hope as Samuel spread the papers across his workbench. Here was potential evidence of the criminal conspiracy that went far beyond Sheriff Dalton's local corruption. This message was sent 3 days ago, Samuel said, pointing to a transcript dated just after Clara May's escape from the gallows. From Sheriff Dalton to someone identified only as M.H. in Denver. Jake read the message aloud. Package secured but container damaged. Implementing contingency protocols. Advise regarding territorial coordination and additional resources. M.H. could be Marcus Henderson, Clara May realized. Package secured probably means they thought they had me, but container damaged suggests my escape complicated their plans. Samuel nodded approvingly. Smart woman. Here's the response that came back 6 hours later. The return message was longer and more detailed. Contingency approved. Territorial assets activated? Accelerate land acquisition timeline. Package must be recovered or permanently contained before federal review begins. Authorize maximum resource deployment. Federal review, Jake repeated. What do you think that means? Territorial status is being reviewed by Congress, Samuel explained. Montana's been pushing for statehood for years. When that happens, there'll be a complete audit of land claims, territorial government operations, law enforcement procedures. Any irregularities will be exposed. Clara May understood the implications immediately. They have a limited window to complete the land theft before federal authorities start asking questions. My evidence could expose everything, so they need to silence me before the review begins. How much time do we have? Jake asked. Samuel consulted a calendar hanging beside his equipment. Federal Review Commission is scheduled to arrive in Helena in 6 weeks. If your evidence can reach them, it could bring down this entire operation. Can you help us contact the commission directly? Clara May asked hopefully. Samuel's expression grew troubled. That's where things get complicated. I tried sending a message to the commission 3 days ago, testing whether the lines were secure. Never got a response, but I did get a visit from 2 men claiming to be territorial officials. They informed me that all communications regarding land disputes must be routed through proper territorial channels, meaning through Sheriff Dalton and his contacts, Jake concluded. Exactly. They've effectively cut off direct communication between this region and federal authorities. Samuel returned to his telegraph key, his fingers resting on its familiar surface. But there might be another way. The old telegrapher explained his idea with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades working with complex communication networks. The main telegraph lines to Helena and Denver were monitored and controlled, but there were smaller, less official lines connecting remote mining camps and railroad construction sites. I maintained contact with telegraph operators in a dozen small communities throughout the territory, Samuel said. Most of them are good men who care more about serving their neighbors than following territorial politics. If we can relay your message through multiple operators, creating a chain that bypasses the controlled lines, we might be able to reach honest authorities. Clara May felt the first real hope she'd experienced in days. What would you need from us? A clear, concise statement of what you witnessed, supported by whatever evidence you can provide. Something detailed enough to convince federal investigators that a full inquiry is warranted. Jake looked concerned about the risks Samuel would be taking. If they discover you're helping us, you'll become a target yourself. Samuel's weathered face creased into a determined smile. Son, I've been operating telegraph equipment since before you were born. I've transmitted military orders during Indian wars, coordinated supply shipments during harsh winters, and helped families locate missing loved ones across thousands of miles of wilderness. I didn't do all that just to stand aside when criminal. Corruption threatens everything decent. People have built in this territory, Clara. May opened her camera bag and withdrew the photographic. plates containing evidence of the fraudulent land markers. These images show Sheriff Dalton and his men placing false boundary markers on legitimately claimed property. Combined with the Telegraph transcripts you've collected, they should provide enough evidence to justify federal intervention. Samuel examined the photographs with the eye of someone who understood their significance. High-quality images, clear documentation of criminal activity. Combined with the communication records, this creates a compelling case. How long will it take to transmit this information through your network? Jake asked. If everything goes smoothly, I can have your evidence in the hands of honest authorities within 48 hours, Samuel replied. But once I start transmitting, Dalton's people will eventually notice unusual telegraph activity. We'll have a limited window before they trace the communications back to this station. Clara May met Jake's eyes, seeing her own determination reflected there. They'd found their path forward. But it would require trusting Samuel Hartwell with their lives and the lives of everyone the criminal network had victimized. There's something else, Samuel said quietly. I've been monitoring territorial law enforcement communications for months. There are honest lawmen in this territory, federal marshals and territorial officials who haven't been corrupted. But they're scattered, undermanned, and often working without complete information about criminal activities in remote areas. You're saying help is out there, but they don't know they're needed, Jake realized. Exactly. Your evidence, transmitted through secure channels, could coordinate a response from multiple law enforcement agencies. Instead of fighting this battle alone, you could find yourselves leading a territorial-wide effort to clean up corruption. Clara May looked at the telegraph key, understanding that it represented far more than just a communication device. It was a lifeline to justice, a connection to the honest authorities they desperately needed to contact. When do we start? She asked. Samuel's fingers moved to the telegraph key with practiced familiarity. Right now. But once I begin transmitting, there's no turning back. Dalton's network will realize they're being exposed. And they'll do everything in their power to stop us. The brass key began clicking under Samuel's expert touch, transmitting the first message in what they hoped would be a chain of communications that reached all the way to Washington. With each click, Clara May felt the weight of 20 years hiding beginning to lift, replaced by the dangerous hope that justice might finally be possible. The bank documents were hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Samuel's telegraph station, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured with twine that had been carefully tied and retied multiple times. Clara May's hands trembled as she unfolded the papers, her face growing pale as she recognized the familiar handwriting that had once penned love letters and business correspondence during their marriage. What is it? Jake asked, noting her sudden stillness. Clara May couldn't immediately find her voice. The letterhead at the top of the document read, Henderson Financial Enterprises, Denver, Colorado Territory, but it was the signature at the bottom that made her blood run cold. Marcus Henderson, written in the same confident script she remembered from 20 years ago, but dated just 3 months prior. He's alive, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Marcus is alive! Jake moved closer, reading over her shoulder as Clara May spread additional documents across Samuel's workbench. What they revealed was a comprehensive business plan for the systematic acquisition of Montana Territory land through fraudulent claims, bribery, and intimidation. I don't understand, Jake said. I thought your husband died in Denver. So did I. Clara May's voice was hollow with shock and growing anger. I attended his funeral. I stood beside his grave. I mourned for a man who was apparently very much alive. Samuel had discovered the documents while investigating telegraph communications related to the land fraud. A corrupt banker in Helena had been careless with his filing system, and when Samuel had gained access to the man's office during a legitimate business visit, he'd found evidence that painted a much larger picture of the criminal enterprise. According to these records, Samuel explained, Marcus Henderson faked his own death in 1863, just months after you disappeared from Denver. The funeral was elaborate, attended by prominent business leaders and politicians. But the man in the coffin was apparently a vagrant who died of natural causes and bore some physical resemblance to Henderson. Clara May studied a bank transfer document that showed massive amounts of money moving from deceased Marcus Henderson's estate to something called the Montana Territory Development Corporation. The dates coincided with her flight to the mountains, suggesting that her husband had used her disappearance as an opportunity to begin his new life as a supposedly dead man. Why fake his death? Jake asked. Because Marcus Henderson had too many enemies and too much scrutiny in Colorado, Clara May realized, the pieces falling into place. Railroad investors who were asking questions about missing funds. Political rivals who were investigating his connections to criminal activities. By dying officially, he could escape all of that and start fresh with a new identity in new territory. The documents revealed the scope of Marcus's reinvention. Operating through carefully constructed business entities and political connections, he'd spent 20 years building a criminal empire that stretched from Denver to Helena. Sheriff Dalton was just one of many local officials who'd been bought, threatened, or replaced with Henderson's chosen men. "Look at this," Samuel said, pointing to a communication log. "Henderson's been coordinating land acquisition activities in 12 different Montana counties. Cedar Ridge is just one small piece of a much larger puzzle." Jake examined a map that showed planned railroad routes through territories that Henderson's organization was systematically acquiring. He's positioning himself to profit from railroad expansion. Buy the land cheap through fraud and intimidation, then sell it to railroad companies at enormous profits. "It's brilliant in a sick way," Clara May admitted. "Use criminal methods to acquire property, then legitimize the ownership through political connections and legal manipulation. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the stolen land will be protected by layers of bureaucracy and corporate ownership." But the most devastating revelation came in a personal letter Marcus had written to a business associate in Denver. Clara May read it aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word, despite the pain the contents caused her. "My late wife's unfortunate curiosity about my business practices necessitated certain dramatic measures. Her accidental death in the mountains, combined with my own strategic demise, eliminated 2 problematic witnesses while providing cover for expanded operations. The frontier territories offer opportunities that civilized places cannot accommodate." Jake saw Clara May's face go white as the implications sank in. "He planned to kill you. He let me run into the mountains, knowing that winter was coming, knowing I had no real survival skills, expecting the wilderness to do what he couldn't bring himself to do directly." Clara May's voice hardened with controlled fury. "He attended my funeral too, didn't he, Samuel? A grieving widower, mourning his beloved wife who tragically perished in a mountain accident." Samuel nodded grimly. "According to these documents, Marcus Henderson held a memorial service for you in Denver 6 months after you disappeared. Very touching affair, according to the newspaper account included in his files. The final piece of Marcus's deception was revealed in a recent business correspondence. He'd been monitoring Clara May's life in the mountains through periodic reports from hired investigators. He'd known for years that she'd survived, built a life for herself, become a respected member of the Cedar Ridge community. He's been watching you, Jake realized. All these years, he's known exactly where you were. Then why didn't he just have me killed earlier? Clara May asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Samuel pointed to a timeline included in Marcus's documents. Because you weren't a threat as long as you stayed hidden in the mountains. It was only when you discovered the land fraud and started gathering evidence that you became dangerous again. The documents painted a picture of calculated patience that was almost more chilling than immediate violence would have been. Marcus had been content to let Clara May live her isolated mountain existence as long as she posed no threat to his criminal enterprise. But her inadvertent discovery of the fraudulent boundary markers had reactivated her status as a liability that required elimination. There's more, Samuel said quietly. producing a final document that made Clara May's blood run cold. It was a detailed plan for eliminating not just Clara May, but anyone who might have knowledge of the land fraud or connections to her mountain community. Doc Henderson was listed as a potential problem who would require permanent resolution once Clara May was captured or killed. The elderly couples being forced from their homesteads were marked for relocation accidents that would eliminate witnesses to the land theft. He's planning to murder everyone, Clara May whispered. Jake studied the list of targeted individuals, recognizing names of decent people who'd never harmed anyone. We have to warn them. Warning them won't be enough, Clara May said, her shock giving way to grim determination. Marcus has spent 20 years building this network, positioning his people in positions of power, creating layers of protection around his criminal activities. Even if we expose some of it, he'll just disappear again and start over somewhere else. Samuel gathered the documents carefully, understanding their significance as evidence. These papers could bring down his entire operation, but only if they reach honest federal authorities before Henderson realizes we have them. Clara May stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountain landscape that had been her refuge for 2 decades. The revelation that Marcus was alive, that he'd been watching her all these years while she'd grieved for their marriage and tried to build a new life, filled her with a complex mixture of rage and determination. He made one mistake, she said finally. What's that? Jake asked. Clara May turned back to them, her face set with the kind of resolve that had carried her through 20 years of mountain survival. He assumed I was still the same frightened young woman who ran into these mountains. He doesn't understand what I've become, what I've learned, what I'm capable of. The documents had revealed the scope of Marcus Henderson's criminal empire, but they'd also revealed his weaknesses. He was operating from a position of assumed superiority, confident that his network of corruption was impenetrable and his enemies were powerless to challenge him. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, recognizing the dangerous glint in Clara May's eyes. "I'm thinking it's time to stop running and start fighting back," Clara May replied. "Marcus wants to play a game of chess with human lives as the pieces. But he's forgotten that sometimes the best strategy is to kick over the board." The twisted truth of their situation was now clear. Clara May wasn't just fighting local corruption or even a territorial criminal network. She was engaged in a personal war with a man who destroyed her life once and was now trying to finish the job. But this time, she wasn't a naive young woman with limited options. She was a survivor who'd learned to thrive in an unforgiving environment, and she had allies who shared her commitment to justice. The real battle was just beginning. The dynamite cache was hidden in an abandoned mine shaft 3 miles northwest of Cedar Ridge, stashed there by miners who'd fled the area when Marcus Henderson's organization began pressuring them to sell their claims below market value. Clara May ran her fingers over the wooden crates, feeling the weight of destruction and possibility they contained. 40 sticks of high-grade mining explosive, she counted aloud, plus blasting caps, fuse cord, and enough black powder to level half the town. Jake examined the materials with the cautious respect of someone who understood their lethal potential. "What exactly are you planning?" "The Harvest Festival," Clara May replied, unfolding a hand-drawn map of Cedar Ridge that showed every building, every street, every potential escape route. 3 days from now, the entire town gathers in the main square to celebrate the end of the growing season. Politicians give speeches, families share food, children play games. It's the one time of year when everyone comes together. The plan that had been forming in Clara May's mind was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. The Harvest Festival would provide the perfect opportunity to expose Marcus Henderson's criminal network to the widest possible audience. But it would also put innocent lives at risk if anything went wrong. "Marcus will be there," she continued. "He can't resist opportunities to present himself as a legitimate businessman and pillar of the community. According to the bank documents Samuel found, he's scheduled to give a speech about economic development and the bright future of Montana Territory. Jake studied the map, noting the positioning of buildings and the natural flow of crowds during the festival. You want to confront him publicly. I want to destroy his credibility completely. Present the evidence of his criminal activities to hundreds of witnesses, including territorial officials and newspaper correspondents who'll be covering the festival. Clara May's voice carried the weight of 20 years planning condensed into desperate urgency. But Marcus won't go down without a fight, and he'll have Sheriff Dalton's men positioned. Throughout the crowd, the dynamite represented more than just explosive power. It was a guarantee that they could control the situation long enough to present their evidence and ensure it reached the right people. Used strategically, it could disable Dalton's ability to suppress the truth through violence and intimidation. We're talking about threatening innocent people, Jake pointed out. We're talking about saving innocent people, Clara May corrected. Every family that's been forced off their land, every homesteader who's been threatened into selling below market value, every decent person who's been intimidated into silence. This is bigger than just Marcus and me. It's about the future of this entire territory. Over the past 2 days, they'd been joined by unexpected allies. Doc Henderson had quietly spread word among trusted friends about the evidence Clara May possessed. Old Pete Henderson and his wife Sarah had ridden up from their threatened ranch, bringing with them the O'Malley family and 3 other displaced homesteaders. Even Martha Whitmore had closed her store for a day to join their planning session. People are ready to stand up, Doc Henderson had reported during their clandestine meeting in an abandoned cabin. They've been waiting for someone to lead, someone to give them hope that fighting back is possible. But Jake remained troubled by the personal dimension of Clara May's confrontation with Marcus. He'd watched her face when she'd read those bank documents, seen the way old pain and new rage had combined into something that worried him. The woman he was falling in love with was preparing for a battle that might consume her, regardless of whether they won or lost. "Promise me something," he said, as they prepared the explosive charges. "Promise me this isn't just about revenge." Clara May paused in her work, meeting his eyes with an honesty that was both reassuring and frightening. "I can't promise that, Jake. Part of this is absolutely about revenge. For 20 years of believing I was a widow, for 20 years of hiding from a man who was very much alive and watching me. But it's also about justice for people who deserve better than what Marcus Henderson's organization has given them." She resumed working with the dynamite, her movements precise and confident. 20 years of mountain living had taught her to handle dangerous materials safely: black powder for hunting, explosive charges for clearing fallen trees from trails, mining equipment left behind by previous claim holders. "The way I see it," she continued, "we have 3 objectives. First, expose Marcus Henderson's criminal network to federal authorities and the general public in a way that can't be suppressed or discredited. Second, ensure that stolen land is returned to its rightful owners. Third, make sure Marcus can never do this to anyone else, anywhere else." Jake helped her measure fuse lengths and position charges for maximum psychological impact rather than maximum destruction. They weren't planning to actually harm anyone. The explosives were meant to create chaos and fear that would break up Dalton's control over the crowd and give Clara May the time and attention she needed to present her evidence. "What about afterward?" Jake asked. "Even if we expose everything, even if we bring down the whole network, Marcus Henderson is still going to want you dead." Clara May's smile was grim but determined. "Then I guess we'll have to make sure he's not in a position to do anything about it." The final element of their plan involved Samuel Hartwell's telegraph network. While Clara May confronted Marcus at the festival, Samuel would be simultaneously transmitting detailed evidence to federal marshals, territorial officials, and newspaper editors throughout the region. Even if Marcus managed to escape immediate consequences, his criminal empire would be exposed and vulnerable. "Timing is everything," Clara May emphasized as they reviewed their preparations. Samuel starts transmitting at exactly 2 o'clock when the festival speeches begin. That gives him an hour to get information to authorities before Marcus realizes what's happening. We create our distraction at 3 o'clock. During Marcus's scheduled speech, Jake secured the last of the explosive charges, his movements betraying none of the anxiety he felt about their desperate gamble. "And if it all goes wrong? Then at least we went down fighting instead of running," Clara May replied. "At least we gave other people a chance to stand up for themselves." As they prepared to leave the mine shaft, Clara May paused and looked back at the remaining explosives. There was something else she hadn't told Jake. A final insurance policy that reflected both her desperation and her determination to ensure Marcus Henderson could never hurt anyone again. She'd prepared one additional charge, carefully concealed and timed to detonate regardless of how the festival confrontation played out. If Marcus escaped justice again, if he managed to disappear and reinvent himself once more, he'd discover that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt and some enemies wouldn't be satisfied with partial victories. Jake was loading their horses when Clara May emerged from the mine shaft, and something in her expression made him study her face carefully. "What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing that changes our plan," she replied, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't exactly the truth either. The ride back towards Cedar Ridge was conducted in thoughtful silence, both of them processing the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. They were two people challenging a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for 20 years. They were risking not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone who'd chosen to support them. But as they crested a hill that provided a panoramic view of the valley below, they could see the evidence of Marcus Henderson's crimes spread out before them like a map of injustice. Empty homesteads where families had been forced to flee, survey markers indicating fraudulent property claims, armed men patrolling boundaries that had been redrawn through corruption and intimidation. "Look at that," Clara May said, pointing toward the town square where festival preparations were already underway. People setting up booths, hanging decorations, preparing to celebrate their community and their hard work. They deserve better than having their lives controlled by criminals who see them as nothing more than obstacles to profit. Jake followed her gaze, seeing not just the physical evidence of criminal activity, but the human cost it represented. Families torn apart, dreams destroyed, honest work stolen by men who produce nothing but fear and corruption. "You're right," he said quietly. "They deserve better. We all deserve better." As they rode toward what might be their final battle, Clara May felt the weight of her father's deputy badge in Jake's shirt pocket, the significance of her mother's locket around her neck, and the explosive power of the charges she'd prepared. 20 years of hiding were about to end, one way or another. The Harvest Festival would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of everyone who'd chosen to believe that justice was still possible in a world increasingly controlled by corruption and greed. The town bell's bronze voice rang out across Cedar Ridge with the deep, resonant authority that had summoned the community to celebration and crisis for nearly 30 years. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he released the bell rope, but his voice carried clearly across the festival crowd as he shouted the words that would change everything. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge, you need to hear the truth about the man who's been stealing your land." The Harvest Festival had drawn nearly 300 people to the town square, families from throughout the valley gathering to celebrate another successful growing season. Children ran between the decorated booths while their parents shared food and conversation. Local politicians and business leaders occupied a raised platform where Marcus Henderson, introduced as prominent Denver businessman and territorial development advocate, had been preparing to deliver his speech about Montana's bright economic future. Marcus Henderson looked exactly as Clara May remembered him, but with 20 years of prosperity and power adding weight to his frame and confidence to his bearing. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his expensive suit immaculate, his smile practiced and politician perfect. He'd been gesturing broadly about territorial progress when the bell began ringing, and Jake's voice cut through his carefully prepared remarks. "That man," Jake continued, pointing directly at Marcus, "has been using Sheriff Dalton and a network of corrupt officials to steal land through fraudulent surveys and forged documents." The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Some people moved closer to hear better, drawn by the drama and Jake's obvious conviction. Others backed away nervously, recognizing potential danger in any public challenge to established authority. Sheriff Dalton and his deputies began pushing through the crowd toward the platform, hands moving toward their weapons. Marcus Henderson's composure never wavered. He stepped forward with the easy authority of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations through confidence and charm. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education and refinement, "it appears we have a disturbed individual disrupting our community celebration. I understand this young man is wanted for serious crimes, including murder." Clara May emerged from behind the platform where she'd been waiting, a camera bag slung across her shoulder and her mother's locket gleaming silver against her throat. The crowd's murmur grew louder as people recognized the woman whose face had been displayed on wanted posters throughout the territory. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying across the suddenly silent square. "You're looking well for a dead man." The effect of her words was electric. Marcus Henderson's practiced composure cracked for just an instant, long enough for several people in the crowd to notice his momentary confusion and fear. But he recovered quickly, his politician's smile returning as he processed this unexpected development. "Clara May," he said with apparently genuine warmth. "My dear, I heard you died in these mountains years ago. What a wonderful surprise to see you alive and well. Is it?" Clara May stepped closer to the platform, her hand resting on her camera bag. "Because according to the documents we found, you've been planning to finish the job you started 20 years ago." Sheriff Dalton had reached the edge of the platform, his hand on his pistol grip. "That's enough. Clara May Thornton, you're under arrest for murder and theft. Surrender now." And the explosion cut off his words with a thunderclap that shook every building in Cedar Ridge. Clara May's carefully positioned dynamite charge had detonated in an empty lot behind the jail, sending a column of dirt and debris 50 feet into the air. The blast was loud enough to be heard for miles, but positioned to avoid injury to anyone, a demonstration of power rather than destruction. The crowd's reaction was immediate and chaotic. Children cried, adults shouted questions, and several people began moving toward the edge of town. But Clara May had anticipated the panic, and Jake was already climbing onto the platform to address the confusion. "Nobody's been hurt," he shouted over the noise. "That was just a demonstration. We need your attention for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to show you proof of the crimes being committed against your community." Marcus Henderson's mask of composure had completely disappeared. He was staring at Clara May with undisguised hatred, all pretense of surprise or pleasure at her survival abandoned. "You always were too clever for your own good. Not clever enough to realize you'd faked your death," Clara May replied, pulling photographs from her bag. "But smart enough to document your current criminal activities." She held up the photographic evidence of the fraudulent boundary markers, the images clear enough for people in the front rows to examine. "These pictures show Sheriff Dalton and his men placing false survey stakes on property that legally belongs to the Henderson Ranch, the O'Malley homestead, and 6 other families in this valley." Doc Henderson stepped forward from the crowd, his medical bag in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. "I can verify that these photographs are authentic," he announced. "And I have copies of forged land documents that show how the theft was accomplished." Sheriff Dalton drew his pistol, but the sound of the bell ringing again made him hesitate. Jake had returned to the bell rope, and each bronze toll seemed to give the crowd more courage to stand their ground and listen. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge," Clara May called out, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You have the right to know who's been stealing from you, and you have the power to stop them." The confrontation that would determine the fate of the entire valley had officially begun. Clara May's rifle spoke with the sharp crack of mountain authority, the bullet striking the wooden platform inches from Sheriff Dalton's boot. The crowd scattered like startled birds, families grabbing children and diving behind festival booths as the careful order of the celebration dissolved into chaos. "Next shot won't be a warning," Clara May announced, working the lever action with practiced efficiency. 20 years of mountain hunting had made her one of the finest marksmen in the territory, and everyone present understood that her threat was both serious and credible. Marcus Henderson raised his hand slowly, his politician's smile replaced by the cold calculation of a man reassessing his tactical position. "Clara May, surely we can discuss this like civilized people. There's no need for violence. You forfeited the right to civilized discussion when you faked your death and spent 20 years stealing from honest families," Clara May replied, keeping her rifle trained on the group of men surrounding Marcus. "Jake, get those documents to the crowd. Let people see exactly what's been done to them." Jake scattered the bank records and forged land documents across the platform, the papers catching in the autumn breeze and floating down to where townspeople could examine them. Mrs. O'Malley was the first to retrieve one of the papers, her face growing pale as she recognized her own property description. "Attached to fraudulent ownership claims. This says our homestead belongs to something called the Montana Territory Development Corporation," she called out to her husband. "Patrick, they're trying to steal our land with fake papers." The revelation rippled through the crowd as more people found documents related to their own properties. Anger replaced fear as families realized the scope of the systematic theft that had been disguised as legitimate legal proceedings. Sheriff Dalton tried to regain control of the situation by drawing his second pistol, but Clara May's rifle swung toward him with deadly precision. "I wouldn't, Sheriff. You're already facing federal charges for land fraud and conspiracy. Adding attempted murder of witnesses won't improve your situation." "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the menacing tone Clara May remembered from their final confrontation 20 years earlier. "This territory needs development, needs investment, needs men with vision to guide its growth. These small-time farmers and ranchers are obstacles to progress. Progress built on theft and murder isn't progress," Clara May replied. "It's just organized crime with better lawyers." The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the edge of town, where a column of uniformed riders was approaching at a steady trot. Clara May felt a moment of fear until she recognized the lead rider's badge and bearing, a federal marshal whose authority superseded any local. "Corruption looks like Samuel's telegraph. Messages reach the right people," Jake observed with satisfaction. Marshal William Garrett rode into the square with 12 deputies, their weapons drawn but not aimed at any specific targets. Clara May lowered her rifle slightly, recognizing that the federal intervention she'd hoped for was finally materializing. "I'm Marshal Garrett, representing the U.S. territorial government," the lead rider announced. "We're here to investigate reports of land fraud, political corruption, and conspiracy charges against local officials." Marcus Henderson stepped forward with renewed confidence, apparently believing that his political connections extended to federal law enforcement. "Marshal, thank goodness you've arrived. We have dangerous criminals disrupting a peaceful community celebration." But Marshal Garrett's response shattered Marcus's assumptions about protection from federal authorities. "Mr. Henderson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, money laundering, and operating a criminal enterprise across state lines." The color drained from Marcus's face as he realized that his network of corruption hadn't extended far enough to protect him from federal investigation. "You can't arrest me. I have rights, political connections, legitimate business interests." "You have the right to remain silent," Marshal Garrett interrupted, dismounting and producing shackles. "Which I'd recommend, since everything you say will be used against you in federal court." Sheriff Dalton made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation by claiming authority over the federal officers. "Marshal, these people are wanted criminals. I have jurisdiction here and—" "You had jurisdiction," Marshal Garrett corrected. "As of this morning, when we received documented evidence of your criminal activities. You've been suspended from all law enforcement duties pending federal investigation." Clara May watched with satisfaction as the criminal network that had terrorized the valley for months began to collapse. But her attention remained focused on Marcus, who was looking around the square with the calculating expression she remembered from their marriage, the look of a man planning his next move. "You think this ends it?" Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying only to Clara May and Jake. "I've built something bigger than one territory, bigger than a few corrupt sheriffs. Cut off this head, and 2 more will take its place." "Maybe," Clara May replied, raising her rifle again. "But you won't be around to see it." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Marcus Henderson, the man who destroyed her first life and threatened her second, stood less than 20 feet away, finally facing consequences for decades of criminal behavior. But Clara May realized that pulling the trigger would make her no better than the corrupt network she'd fought so hard to expose. "Jake," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Marcus. "Tell Marshal Garrett about the additional evidence we've collected. Bank records, communication logs, lists of other territorial officials who've been compromised." As Jake provided the federal officers with a comprehensive briefing on Marcus's criminal empire, Clara May felt the weight of 20 years' anger beginning to lift from her shoulders. Justice didn't require her personal participation in Marcus's punishment. It just required ensuring that the truth reached honest authorities who could act on it. Clara May Thornton. Marshal Garrett called out, "We'll need your testimony for the federal prosecution. Are you willing to cooperate with our investigation?" "I've been waiting 20 years for someone honest to ask me that question," Clara May replied. The crowd that had scattered during the initial confrontation began returning to the square, drawn by curiosity and the realization that they were witnessing a historic moment. The families who'd been forced from their homes, the business owners who'd been intimidated into silence, the decent citizens who'd watched their community deteriorate under corrupt leadership, all of them pressed closer to see justice finally being served. Marcus Henderson was secured in shackles, but his eyes never left Clara May's face. "This isn't over," he said, as Marshal Garrett's deputies prepared to transport him to territorial headquarters. "Yes, it is," Clara May replied with quiet finality. "It's been over for 20 years. I just needed time to realize it." As the federal officers led Marcus and Sheriff Dalton away from the square, the crowd began to cheer. Not the polite applause of a political rally, but the genuine celebration of people who'd seen their oppressors removed and their community restored to honest governance. Jake approached Clara May and gently took her rifle, setting it aside before pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long and dangerous journey. "It's finished," he whispered against her hair. Clara May leaned into his strength, feeling truly safe for the first time in 20 years. Around them, the Harvest Festival was beginning to resume its original purpose, a celebration of community, hard work, and the hope that tomorrow would be better than today. The battle was over. Justice had prevailed, and Clara May Thornton was finally free to build the life she'd always deserved. 6 months after the Harvest Festival confrontation, Clara May stood in the doorway of her mountain cabin, watching Jake repair the fence around their expanded garden. The spring morning was crisp and clear, filled with the promise of new beginnings that seemed to define every aspect of their life together. The old wedding ring that had symbolized her marriage to Marcus Henderson lay buried beneath a pile of stones beside. Copper Creek, replaced by a simple gold band that Jake had crafted from nuggets panned from their own stream. The weight of it on her finger felt different, not like a chain binding her to someone else's expectations, but like a foundation supporting dreams they'd built together. "Mrs. Morrison," Jake called out with a grin that never failed to make her heart skip. "You planning to supervise my work all morning, or are you going to help me with these fence posts?" "I'm admiring the view, Mr. Morrison," she replied, stepping into the sunlight, "and thinking about how different everything looks when you're not running for your life." The transformation of Cedar Ridge had been remarkable to witness. With Sheriff Dalton and his corrupt network removed from power, honest governance had returned to the valley. Federal investigators had spent months unraveling Marcus Henderson's criminal empire, returning stolen land to its rightful owners and prosecuting corrupt officials. Throughout the territory, the O'Malley family had reclaimed their homestead and expanded it with a new barn and additional livestock. Old Pete Henderson and his wife Sarah had not only kept their ranch, but had been compensated for the financial losses they'd suffered during the period of illegal intimidation. Even the Williams family, who'd fled the valley during the worst of the corruption, had returned to rebuild their farm. Doc Henderson visited regularly, bringing news from town and medical supplies to their remote location. The elderly physician had aged visibly during the crisis, but his eyes now carried the satisfaction of a man who'd seen justice prevail despite overwhelming odds. "Heard from Marshal Garrett yesterday," Doc had reported during his most recent visit. "Marcus Henderson's trial is scheduled for next month in Denver. Federal prosecutors say they have enough evidence to put him away for 20 years, maybe life." Clara May had felt surprisingly little satisfaction at that news. Her anger toward Marcus had been replaced by something more complex, a kind of sad understanding that his choices had destroyed not only other people's lives, but his own potential for happiness and redemption. The man she'd once loved had become someone she barely recognized, consumed by greed and the need to control everything around him. Jake joined her on the cabin's small porch, settling beside her on the wooden bench they'd built together. His transformation had been as remarkable as hers. The haunted uncertainty that had marked him when they first met had been replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who'd found his purpose. Letter came from the territorial government, he said, producing an official-looking envelope from his shirt pocket. "They're offering me a position as Deputy Territorial Marshal, helping to clean up corruption in remote districts." Clara May studied his face, noting the way his eyes lit up when he mentioned the opportunity. "It's what your father would have wanted for you. It's what I want for me," Jake corrected. "But only if you're willing to share that kind of life. It would mean travel, danger, time away from the cabin." Clara May considered the offer, weighing her love for their peaceful mountain existence against the knowledge that there were other communities facing the same corruption they'd overcome. The battle against Marcus Henderson's network had taught her that justice required active participation, not just passive hope. "We'd keep the cabin as our base," she said thoughtfully. "But we'd also help other people who don't have the resources or connections to fight back against organized crime." Jake nodded, understanding that she'd already made her decision. "Partners in everything. Partners in everything," she agreed. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the trail leading up from the valley. Samuel Hartwell rode into their clearing, accompanied by a younger man wearing a telegraph operator's equipment and the eager expression of someone carrying important news. "Clara May." "Jake!" Samuel called out with obvious excitement. "Got word from Washington that you need to hear." The news was better than they dared to hope. Congress had approved Montana's application for statehood, with the federal investigation of territorial corruption cited as evidence of the region's commitment to honest governance. The systematic cleanup of criminal networks throughout the territory had demonstrated that local communities could police themselves when given proper support from federal authorities. "They're calling it the Henderson investigation," Samuel explained, "using it as a model for cleaning up corruption in other territories seeking statehood." Clara May and Jake exchanged glances, recognizing that their personal battle against Marcus Henderson had somehow become part of a larger movement toward honest government in the American West. "There's more," the young telegraph operator added. "Newspaper editors throughout the country want to interview you. Clara May, they're calling you the mountain woman who brought down a criminal empire." Clara May laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful valley like music. I suppose that's better than being remembered as the woman who was almost hanged for telling the truth. As their visitors prepared to leave, carrying with them Clara May and Jake's acceptance of the deputy marshal position, the couple stood together, watching the sun climb higher over the mountain peaks that had sheltered and shaped them. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, his arm around her waist. Clara May thought about the question seriously, considering everything they'd lost and gained over the past year. The quiet simplicity of her solitary mountain existence was gone, replaced by a life that would be more complex, more dangerous, but also more connected to the broader human community. "None," she said finally. "For the first time in 20 years, I feel like I'm living the life I was meant to live." Jake pulled her closer, watching a pair of eagles soar above the valley they'd fought to protect. "Then let's get started on the rest of it." The mountain woman who'd once hidden from the world was ready to help change it, one corrupt network at a time. Justice had found its way to Cedar Ridge, and now Clara May and Jake Morrison would carry it to wherever it was needed most. Their greatest adventure was just beginning.